Good afternoon. Thank you for having us. We're Team Artemis. My name is Benga, and I'm joined here by my colleagues Mike, Ryan, and Adam. We're excited to present to you an ideal solution to the portfolio where we think it's going to not just focus on sustainable solutions, but also not hurt the local economy and not sacrifice returns. We approach this from a unique perspective that not only considers financial capital, but human capital. We're going to focus on 5 areas: the mandate, our investment philosophy, the ESG framework, the choice of divestment, and finally, our asset allocation.
So in defining the mandate, the first and foremost, sorry. What? So in defining the mandate, we narrowed it down to 3 competing stakeholder priorities. So starting from the top, our first and foremost responsibility is our fiduciary duty to the pension beneficiaries. Our initial objective is to earn a 6% net of fee total return while minimizing the portfolio volatility. Second, we want to incorporate sustainable solutions, but without compromising our return objectives. And finally, we want to continue to invest in the local economy and its long-term interests by directly investing. Our goal is to create a solution that satisfies the desires of each of these 3 competing priorities. So how do we do this? We do this by incorporating human capital as part of the asset allocation. Human capital represents the future income stream that the plan participants will contribute and has its own set of unique risks and characteristics. Human capital ultimately drives how we invest our financial capital, which leads to our optimal asset allocation. What's interesting is when you consider the drivers of the future income stream of the plan participants in Canada, the direct investments in Canada, and the public investments with Canada, you see that there is considerable exposure to the local economy and Canada as a whole. Overall, we think this approach leads to better risk-adjusted returns, it brings consensus among the stakeholders, and it's more sustainable.
Yeah, sustainability is a huge focus for us throughout. On screen right now, we have the pillars of our ESG philosophy, and we use this as a starting point when developing our sustainable recommendations for NLPIB, which come in the form of a 3-pronged framework that considers both expected environmental and performance impact. Now, the first step is related to the direct portfolio, where we recommend that NLPIB engage with management of the direct holding companies, both collectively and individually, to help advance their sustainable agenda. The second is related to the indirect portfolio, where following implementation of our proposed allocation, the committee could hire external managers that are going to integrate ESG factor analysis into the investment process. And finally, if the committee is comfortable and to the extent that attractive investment opportunities present themselves, consider issuing some green bonds using those proceeds to fund some locally based sustainable projects. Now, for the divestment question, we recommend that NLPIB not immediately divest of South White Rose. We offer 4 reasons why. I'm just going to hit on 2 of those. First, this is a highly illiquid asset, and if we were trying to immediately divest, we'd likely have to incur fire sale pricing, and pensioners have stated that they're not willing to sacrifice returns for ESG compliance. And second, we believe, along with other philanthropic leaders such as Bill Gates, that divestment is not the most effective way to combat climate change. So instead of passing the buck on to someone else and hope that they're going to do the right thing, we'd rather own the asset ourselves, and we offer a proactive proposal to combating climate change through that South White Rose investment. And some of the themes that we have for South White Rose, they also apply to other directly held investments. Next slide. We have individual recommendations for each, but at a high level, first of all, don't divest of any directly held investments. We believe that replacing those investments, if we had to unwind, would be particularly challenging to come up with an investment that would support the local economy in the same way, and also receiving an appropriate level of return. Opportunistically trim if at a fair price, if a sustainably minded buyer comes along. We recognize there are concentrations in the portfolio, But we also realize that it's going to be very challenging to find both the fair-priced and sustainably-minded buyers. So we focus most of our attention on diversifying in other areas of the portfolio.
So diversification. We take our diversification idea and build on our baseline portfolio. From this, we're able to make some assumptions and ultimately optimize our portfolio, take the findings, and ultimately make an allocation decision. This is a multi-step approach, but it's quite intuitive if you really think about it. So we make some additional investment considerations, which are in line with a lot of global and Canadian pension funds to add to diversification and returns. First, we consider United States stocks, in particular the S&P 500, which has outperformed the TSX over the long run, and small cap stocks like the Russell 2000, which has had higher returns than large cap stocks over time, albeit with a little bit more volatility. We look at emerging market bonds, which are a better alternative in a lower rate environment, especially as you've seen emerging economies improve and become slightly less of a risk. And then finally, we consider gold, which is an efficient investment that's delivered returns on par with the stock market over the long run, is negatively correlated to Canada and the Canadian market, and protects against currency depreciation, which is a concern. You can't take historical behavior and make the assumption that that's going to be the way things will work going forward. So what we do is we think about the current environment and are able to then forecast and model. So how do we do that? We do that via Michaud optimization, which builds on Markowitz Frontier, but works on some of the short holdings that Markowitz has related to historical data. It allows you to take the unknown of the future and make your own forecast assumptions to run Monte Carlo analysis and come up with a multitude of efficient frontiers with an ideal portfolio. Now, a few assumptions we had to make, in particular related to direct investments. Now, direct investments, we didn't have a lot of historical data for performance, so what we did is we used public market equivalents, which is very common in the private equity space, to make proxy investments to look at potential performance. We shifted our rate environment levels given the current rate environment, and which is found to be very consistent with historical behavior. And finally, and most importantly, we factored human capital into the decision. Now, we were able to do this by allocating that component of the portfolio to the Canadian stock market. So what are our findings? We found that direct investments, go back please, direct investments provided better returns than divestments. When you factored in the Canadian economy, the Canadian stock exposure needed to be reduced to appropriately diversify the portfolio, which also led to a reduction in emerging market, private equity, and foreign stocks because they are highly correlated to the Canadian markets. This led to more US large and small cap exposure. And finally, less corporates because of the lower rates, but an increase in tip exposure because of the potential future inflation, as well as to be able to assume the liabilities of the pension over the long run. And finally, the gold weight is meaningful as it provided the returns, the diversification, in particular as it related to the Canadian economy as well as the energy sector as a whole. So our proposed portfolio, click one more. Our proposed portfolio makes some meaningful changes, but they're not so significant that it could cause the board to have some concern. What we're able to do is to achieve a much higher expected return than a typical Canadian pension fund, the current fund, and doing so with having a lower tracking error and a higher Sharpe ratio. Now, we're able to do this by reducing our equity and fixed income exposure and adding to our alternatives investments. Go ahead. So as you can see here on the left side, it's very clear that the expected return going from a typical fund to our proposed portfolio has a higher expected return with lower expected volatility. And when you look at our efficient frontier, you can see our proposed portfolio and all our potential portfolios fall above the efficient frontier, whereas the current and typical portfolio fall well below. Ultimately, it's imperative to incorporate human capital into our allocation decision. By not doing so, you're placing all your eggs in one basket as it relates to Canada. Second, as ideal as it would be to divest all our non-ESG or other exposure, doing so hastily could hurt current performance and ultimately the long-term performance of the fund. And finally, we believe you should have direct engagement and utilize the power of our market to engage with companies to increase sustainability. Ultimately, we believe our portfolio will provide superior ex-ante adjusted returns in a more sustainable environment while satisfying the needs of all the main players and the board.